First, let me introduce our guest, Joe Waters. Joe is the co-founder and CEO of Capita, an independent, nonpartisan think tank with a global focus. Since starting Capita in 2018, Joe has developed forward-leaning initiatives exploring how the great cultural, planetary, and social transformations of our day affect our youngest children, that is those 0 to 8 years old, and our communities, from climate change to parental loneliness and social disconnection. A 2021 Aspen Institute Ascend Fellow, Joe's commentary has been on issues facing families has been published in many leading publications. He has been an invited speaker at the White House First Forum on Social Impact Finance, the LEGO Ideas Conference, Think Future, and the World Forum on Early Care and Education. He serves as a senior advisor at Open Fields, a Greenville, South Carolina consulting firm. Prior to starting Capita, Joe was the executive vice president of the Institute for Child Success. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from Furman University and a master's degree in divinity from Duke University. Please join me in welcoming Joe Waters this morning, and many thanks to coalition member Claire Noonan, representing AAUW and other organizations, for suggesting we invite Joe to speak with us. Joe is going to do a presentation with some slides managed by Joe Beninato. Thank you so much, both Joes. And then I will go to some questions that the steering committee has prepared before opening it up to questions from all of you. So over to you, Joe. Thank you so much.
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you, and I really appreciate the invitation. In the introduction, Marie spoke about the great planetary challenges of our day, and that's and how they affect young children is a key area of focus for us. And for the last several years, we have been exploring the impacts of climate change on young children. And in reality, we believe, we say, based on the evidence, that climate change presents the greatest threat to healthy human development in the earliest years of life that we've ever faced, at least in this country. So it's a huge challenge that we frankly are not taking on with a particular focus on young children. And so, as you'll see here in the presentation, part of our work in this area, and I'd be happy to share some of the other work that we do in this area, but part of the work we've done in this area in the last 2 years has been convening the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Task Force in collaboration with our colleagues at the Aspen Institute. And they have produced the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Plan, and that's what I'll be speaking with you about today. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. In the earliest stages of life, from before birth through age 8, children develop rapidly and have a distinct biology that makes them uniquely sensitive to their environments and to their exposures. Next slide, please. Young children's experiences and the places they spend time shape their path to adulthood. And climate change is, as we know, intensifying. It is shaping the environments in which children are living, growing, and developing. And that makes it harder to provide the sorts of nurturing places and experiences that help children to become healthy, resilient adults. Next slide. When communities are set up to support those experiences and places, those communities become healthier and more resilient. And children become healthier and more resilient in the context of healthy and resilient communities. So it's a virtuous flywheel that we're trying to create in our communities, particularly in the climate era. Next slide. Climate change is the context in which we are all living today. We like to say that climate change is not an issue, it's an era. We're living in the era of climate disruption. It is the surrounding context for all aspects of early childhood development and for every child and family serving system. Our social and environmental challenges are one. We're not asking in our work, and in particular in the work of the task force and this action plan, we're not asking everyone to take on climate change. We're asking everyone to reimagine their work in the context of climate change. For example, recognizing families increasingly face greater financial risks as a result of more frequent and more extreme hurricanes in Florida. You all have plenty of examples too in California, and we heard, in fact, from a number of people, the task force did in public testimony, from a number of people in California or in the early care and education sector in particular, who are already having to drastically reimagine their existing work given climate disruptions. And those financial risks from more frequent and extreme weather events and so forth seriously imperil the sorts of intergenerational prosperity that we're all working to build from the earliest years of life. Pediatric primary care providers, as another example, need to reimagine their services given the health impacts of climate change. And state child care administrators, another example, need to make heat emergency preparedness plans to support the child care sector during extreme heat events. So again, all this to emphasize, we need to reimagine our existing work in the context, for the context of climate disruption. We're not asking everyone to suddenly give up what they've been doing to become a climate advocate. Next slide, please. In the fall of 2022, the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Task Force, 20 early years leaders, climate leaders, researchers, medical professionals, parents, philanthropists, and others came together to recognize the urgency of climate change and the opportunity for the early years sectors to partner with those working on climate action to create more sustainable, resilient, and equitable society. Next slide. Over the past 18 months, the task force held a listening tour around the country to learn about the impacts of climate change on young children, as well as the unique needs of and opportunities to support young children, their families, and the programs that serve them in a changing climate. We heard from caregivers, providers, doctors, researchers, and community leaders from across the country, from diverse communities, and we were inspired by their leadership, advocacy, and action, and we've grounded the action plan in what we learned and what we heard directly from people across the country. Next slide. What is the scope of the challenge? There are 33 million children aged 8 and younger across the United States, and they are the most vulnerable to climate change, and particularly to the health impacts of climate change. For example, the World Health Organization, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the CDC, and others have stated that young children under the age of 5, bear 90% of the global disease burden of climate change. So this is a crisis that disproportionately affects our youngest children. Next slide, please. And yet we're doing rather little to focus specifically on young children. And this is just one snapshot of how little we're actually doing. So of the 40 largest cities in the United States, 34 have adopted or drafted climate action plans. 16 of those mention the health and well-being of young children, but most of those mentions tend to be oriented towards arguing that we need to adopt climate action plans to support the health and well-being of our young children, but they do not make specific recommendations to address the disproportionate impacts of climate change on young children. Only 5 of the 40 largest cities and 5 of the 34 climate action plans, only 5, have noted young children as a population with distinct needs in the face of climate disruption. So this is just an example of how we have a lot of work to do to put young children at the heart of climate action across the country, cities, counties, states, and so forth, to put young children at the heart of climate action, given that they disproportionately bear, in particular, the health impacts of climate disruption. Next slide, please. So what are some of the recommendations? You can go ahead to the next slide in the action plan. Ensuring healthy development that builds resilience in children is work that cannot be done in isolation. It's an opportunity for collaboration across families, child and family-facing programs, policymakers at all levels of government, businesses, nonprofits, faith communities, philanthropy, advocates, and more. And we believe that in this action plan, there's something for everybody. We make recommendations to support collaboration between all of those sectors and stakeholders. Next slide. You can go ahead to the next slide. Thanks. So what can local governments do? Although federal and state governments help create enabling conditions, local governments drive implementation and climate action within communities. Local governments need to integrate the perspectives of young children, their families, and those who support them in planning and taking action on climate change. You can go to the next slide, please. Local governments can incorporate the early years into climate planning and action by building authentic connections with young children and their families, especially those who have been historically marginalized. For example, early years providers and organizations need to be included in climate planning decisions. And what we heard from across the country is that they often aren't at this point. We need to support collaboration between the early years and local governmental agencies. For example, local governments have a lot of authority relative to, sorry, can you go back to the local government slide? Yeah, thank you very much. So local governments, for example, have a lot of authority and act as a tremendous resource for early childhood providers, childcare providers in particular. And so, local governments need to increase their collaboration and frankly, their support. Now, a concrete example of this is that in a heat emergency, local governments need to know, frankly, where family child care providers are, how many children are in their care, and have resources and recommendations to support family child care providers who are providing care in their home in the event of a heat emergency. Another recommendation is that we need to increase access to family-focused and climate-resilient outdoor spaces. And, not only is this good for children, it's good for the whole community. We all benefit from more green space, and we all benefit in this way, which I find fascinating. It helps to, these child and family-friendly spaces can also help cool our communities. More green space helps cool our communities and thus contributes to the mitigation of climate impacts, extreme heat in particular being one example. Local governments can also advance strategies to support early years providers in ensuring safe, healthy, reliable, and high-quality services for children in a changing climate. An example of this is local air quality monitoring infrastructure to be able to provide pediatric primary care providers, nursing workforce, and others with real-time data so that they can provide anticipatory guidance on the effects of poor air quality to the children and families in their care. Local governments can also build the ability of neighborhoods to support young children and families by expanding access to climate resilience hubs, community aid, and fostering social connection. Next slide now, please. So what can the early years providers do? In the action plan, we defined early years providers as childcare programs, pediatric healthcare providers, home visitors, doulas, and others who care for young children. They have key roles in helping develop and implement governmental policies on climate and young children. They also ensure that their fields of practice can integrate best practices into their work and their standards. So next slide. We recommend the following actions in the report: upgrading early years facilities to advance climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience; conduct and incorporate climate risk screenings and sharing of information with families. So think here in particular about the pediatric well child visit. Pediatric well child visit is a privileged, frequent encounter in the earliest years of life. For the most part, pediatric primary care providers, to our understanding, are not there are not validated climate risk screeners that they're using in the pediatric well child visit, and they don't have a lot of standard anticipatory guidance to provide to families in the event of climate impacts, and if that is needed in the event of climate impacts, and it will be. Providers can distribute electronic and phone warnings and guidance during extreme climate-related events to expecting parents and families with young children. They can integrate training and anticipatory guidance on the impacts of climate change into professional associations, degrees, and certification programs. And they can build climate resilience into childcare providers' outdoor learning spaces. Next slide, please. So what about the philanthropic sector? And I just want to say at this stage in this presentation that there are about 96 pages of recommendations in the action plan. I'm giving you just a taste, and I'm giving you just a taste for what 3 categories of stakeholders can do. There's a lot more, for example, in terms of what the federal government and state governments can do. And I'd encourage you to take a look at the plan for those. But what can philanthropy do? Philanthropy plays, obviously, a pivotal role in supporting a wide range of early years and climate change issues, but rarely at their intersection. And we've found this across the board and across the country. There are many funders who fund early childhood programs and services, and there are many funders, and a lot of those funders also fund climate change. We have yet to find probably more than 4 or 5 examples of where those programmatic areas within a foundation have funded something together, or at least are even talking and learning from one another in a foundation. So there's a lot of work, obviously, that can be done. And philanthropy can also support intergenerational organizing and collaboration, enable innovation, and develop best practices for families, child and family-facing programs, and communities. Next slide. So what are some of the recommendations for philanthropy? Just being explicit about supporting work that connects the early years and climate change, and even within their own philanthropies and within the philanthropic community, support shared and mutual learning. They can also develop a national scorecard. This is one of the recommendations in the action plan on the state of young children and climate change. And of course, simply better understanding the impacts of climate change on young children is critically important to addressing this issue. And as Ari Bernstein, who is now at the CDC, used to be at Harvard, says, we're really in the dark ages. We're living in the dark ages when it comes to information about how discrete climate-related events are impacting the health and development of our youngest children. So, for example, we don't know as much as we need to know about the impacts of poor air quality, extreme heat on the long-term health of children, how early exposures are impacting long-term health. We still need to know a lot more, and there's a key role for philanthropy in supporting research in that way. Philanthropy can also support and recognize, lift up communities, best practices, share best practices, advance best practices for how communities are already promoting the healthy development of young children in a changing climate. I'll give you just one example. We came across a doula collective in Louisiana that is working with local stakeholders in the New Orleans area to support lactation continuity for breastfeeding moms and supporting their children in the event of an evacuation from a hurricane. So these are things that, frankly, I had never really thought about. But if you have to evacuate, if you lose power, don't have access to refrigeration, for example, to store milk, it can really be seriously disruptive and damaging to the health of a newborn. And they're, as a doula collective, they're coming up with solutions and supporting the needs of new moms in the face of evacuations from hurricanes and the other impacts of hurricanes on the Louisiana coast. So those are the types of examples that we need to be holding up, and philanthropy can certainly help promote those and awareness of those around the country and scale what works. So next slide, please. This is where you can find all of the recommendations. Encourage you to go there to read the report. And I'm happy to take your questions, starting with Marie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe, for a great presentation. And let's see. Well, let me start with asking some questions of you, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, the participants, for their questions. Can you say a little bit more about what Capita is and does?
Yeah, so Capita is a think tank, which means that, you know, I like to say we do the things that think tanks do, which is not just think, but try to influence the public policy process. And this report here is a great example. Not only have we, you know, delivered a report to the general public, but we've shared that with members of Congress. We're working actively to share it with mayors and community leaders across the country, with groups like this Community Coalition, to raise awareness and, frankly, to influence the public policy process so that these recommendations will be implemented. Our work focuses in two primary areas: putting young children and their families at the heart of climate action. And I think you got a good flavor for how we do that in this report. The other area of focus for us is building a culture of solidarity and care. We believe that, and I'd be happy to share more about this, but let me just say that, you know, we all know that we're living in a time of populism, polarization, post-truth, loneliness, social disconnection, isolation, and alienation. It's a real menu of things that drive alienation and disconnection across the country and across the world, and that is taking its toll on young children and their families, also taking its toll on the systems and, frankly, the trust that we have as Americans in particular in systems that serve and that meet the needs of young children. And so we're trying to address how, you know, specific ways that this culture of loneliness, isolation, and alienation in our country is impacting young children, and proposing solutions to the crisis of loneliness that put young children, their families, and their communities first.
Thank you for that. You mentioned that, or you had a whole slide on what local government can do and the importance of local government action. What else would you recommend for a small community such as Los Altos? And we have our mayor here today, who's one of his priorities is emergency preparedness. So this is a perfect topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, first of all, we need to make sure not only that the disparate impacts of young children are incorporated in emergency preparedness planning, but we also are explicitly including our providers. So let me just say a couple of things about this. First of all, there are a lot of childcare providers in particular who are off the grid, so to speak. And often are ignored and left behind in a lot of planning that goes on at a city level. We need to make sure that those family childcare providers in particular, who are operating out of their homes, who are taking care of kids in their homes, who are often ignored and marginalized, that they're included in climate-related emergency planning, and that they show up in a real way, in a meaningful way in those plans. I think of extreme heat as an example, right? If I'm taking care of 6 kids in my house and we have hit 110 degrees or whatever the case may be, like it was in Phoenix last summer, and my air conditioning goes out, do I know what to do? Do I know who to call? Does the fire department know how to respond in that situation when I've got 6 kids that I'm taking care of? I can't just load them up in a car and take them to the mall. Yet they're in a potentially deadly situation. And I think, what we've seen across the country is that a lot of communities have just not really thought about them, family child care providers, as just one example, as a particular category of people and business that needs to be incorporated in our emergency preparedness planning. So maybe I'll just stop there. I could say more, but happy to also dialogue about that further if it's of interest.
Well, now I know your focus is on young children, but for example, I have a 9-year-old grandson, and we've got a lot of grandparents on this call who probably have children who are older, and also a lot of connections with the schools in Los Altos and that serve our community, both elementary school, high school, etc.
Mhm.
You have, what would you say about those kids though that have aged out of the young children category, so to speak?
I'm tempted to say not my problem, but I will not say that. Obviously, we need to take care of everyone in our communities, and much of what impacts young children in particular also disproportionately impacts the elderly. Schools are a tremendous resource, and I would say that our colleagues point you all to the fact that our colleagues at the Aspen Institute, This is Planet Ed, have created a K-12 climate action plan that focuses on those children ages above the age of 8. So, and now they're working on a higher education action plan as well. So really what they're trying to do is to create a series of recommendations with our, beginning with our work together, that takes us from cradle to career, from the early years straight through higher education. So there are a bunch of resources out there, specifically for the older population that you described. But on the example of childcare in particular, I think it's really important to say that there are a lot of kids who are 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 who are in childcare as after school care. And so, while we might be focused primarily on infants and toddlers who are in childcare and the childcare programs that serve them and the needs that they have that as related to climate change, many of those same providers come 2:00, come 2:30 in the afternoon, they're also taking care of those school-aged kids.
Okay, good. Thank you. I understand that you recently participated in COP28 in Dubai.
Yes.
What
Yeah.
is COP and why did you want to participate?
Well, COP is the Conference of Parties. That's what it stands for. So this is the annual meeting happening since I think 1994, 1995, of all the parties that have signed on to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So, for example, the Paris Agreement, which we hear a lot about, was signed at the COP that took place in Paris in 2015. My impressions of it are that it's in the there are something like 85,000 people there. So there's a lot that's going on around COP, around the UN negotiations that are happening really at the center of the COP. But then you also have what is essentially a trade fair and an ideas festival, climate-focused ideas festival happening around the negotiations. In this case, we were there at the invitation of the Early Childhood Authority of Abu Dhabi and participating in the United Arab Emirates as the host country, their Ministry of Education pavilion that they hosted. And so, the things that we were talking about, types of things that we were talking about here, of course, but from a global perspective, and I would say that it's always fascinating to hear both how communities around the world are being impacted by climate change. So, for example, we were joined by a colleague from the Asia Pacific region who has done a lot of work on everything from the impacts of climate change on low-lying island nations to air quality in places like Kathmandu and Delhi, and how that is impacting young children. So it's interesting to hear the various perspectives, of course, but also the various solutions. And in particular, there are some very creative solutions from the global South. Work happening in Santiago around greening spaces. Work happening around food waste in South Africa that we were able to learn about and to also share, because we were co-hosting the discussions with the Early Childhood Authority of Abu Dhabi.
So I think it's fair to say that you learned a lot by going to that conference
Yeah, we learned a lot.
about what's happening around
For
the
sure,
world.
about what's happening, how climate change is impacting young children. I mean, frankly, it's also overwhelming, right? The scale of the solutions, the scale of the problem, but also the ingenuity of the solutions is frankly really overwhelming.
And is most of it local rather than nationally focused, or?
No, I mean, of course, no, I would say it seems to be fairly nationally focused, though there's a strong contingent. And of course, despite being there for 9 days, I mean, I was only able to take in so much myself, but there's a strong contingent in particular of mayors from around the world who are really leading on both local adaptation, but strong advocates for mitigation. And of course, the Loss and Damage Fund was initial funding commitments were made and announced, and that's going to be tremendous. That represents tremendous progress, particularly for the least developed countries and those most vulnerable to climate impacts.
That's good, finally, huh? So you talked about the importance of collaboration, that nobody can do this alone. It's such a big issue. And you have partners such as the Low Income Investment Fund. What's the nature of those partnerships, and how do they interact with Capita?
Mm-hmm. Well, each partnership is different, of course, and we had a number of organizations represented on the task force, right? So it is our hope that many of those organizations who had representatives on the task force are going to take forward the recommendations and to incorporate them into their own agendas. And also, there seems to be a bit of a coalition forming as well of organizations that want to advocate for these recommendations, particularly at the federal level. So in terms of our relationships with them, that we are collaborating intensely in some cases. We are learning from others in other cases, and we are, frankly, on the sidelines cheerleading as some organizations take pieces of the action plan, some of the recommendations forward in particular ways. I'll give you an example with the Low Income Investment Fund in particular. They've done some phenomenal work, which we had no part of, on the impact of flooding on childcare facilities in New York City. It's actually a tremendous problem, one we don't think a lot about, but one that we've been able to help amplify based on their really strong data-driven research.
Okay, thank you. If you had a magic wand, what's the one thing you would do to advance your goals?
I would somehow reframe the earliest years of life from being a soft policy issue to being a very hard and important policy issue. So let me explain what I mean. We're working on the most important time of life for healthy human development and human capital formation. The earliest years of life are critical to the long-term success, security, and prosperity of our country. I think we all know that, at least intuitively, but the research absolutely backs it up. Yet policies focused on the earliest years of life tend to be marginalized. Historically, they've been issues that women in Congress, for example, champion. They're not taken as seriously by, particularly by a lot of the men in Congress and in state houses across the country. People want to work on foreign policy, right? They're sort of edging themselves when they get to Washington to get on the Foreign Relations Committee, throwing elbows to get on the Foreign Relations Committee, to get onto the Finance Committee and so forth. I don't think they're doing the same to get on health, education, labor, and pensions to work on issues impacting young children and their families. But at the same time, we need to make sure that the issues impacting young children and their families are included on the agenda of the Finance Committee. There's a sense in which early years policy, human development policy in the earliest years of life is not treated as a serious policy issue as we would treat employment, monetary policy, foreign policy, so forth. And so I think if I had a magic wand, I would somehow move it into being seen as a serious policy endeavor.
Well, I can certainly support you on that. Having spent a lot of my career trying to advocating for early childhood as an important policy issue. This is the last question for you that I have. All right, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share? So get ready, everybody, because we're about to open it up for your questions.
For me, final thoughts. First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for your interest. It's always exciting to speak to folks in a particular community who care a lot about their particular community and are willing to advance good things for the children and families who live in your community. I think I would just say this as it relates to the Early Years Climate Action Plan. We would love to see you and communities across California, communities across the country, just take even one recommendation in the action plan that you think you can advance and work to advance it, right? So that could be as simple as, Mayor, how can we make sure the early years are included in emergency preparedness at the city level? And if y'all do nothing more than consider that question at city council or wherever, whatever forum is appropriate, that's the type of thing we're looking for, and we certainly would consider all of that moving us all as a country in the right direction to ensure that our children can flourish in the context of a disrupted and changing climate.
Thank you so much, Joe, for a great conversation. I'm going to open it up now to questions from the attendees. Please raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you. Remember, one question per person and no speeches, please. And you're all muted, so if you want to ask a question, you're going to need to unmute. Let me see here. I don't see. Oh, Gary, go for it.
Thank you, Marie. I see Janine's up there with her hand up too. But my question, Joe, is how do you talk to the young children? Just by way of context, Margie Swallow and I from Greentown talked to third graders last week about climate change and what they could do. We have to be very gentle in the way we describe it. They're really sweet kids at that age. They're 9 years old, but a bit naive. So one suggestion I had was, well, you're old enough to help me plant a tree, and that's looking to the future. So what do you have? Any specifics on how to talk to children?
Yeah, that's good. So there's a lot out there that is not particularly helpful. So apparently there's a baby board book. I haven't seen it myself, but I've heard it described that talks about the thermal heat trapping blanket. This is not the type of thing that our youngest kids need. That's not especially helpful. I'm sure
That's
whoever
right.
wrote that book was
That's a little
very well
scary.
meaning. But yeah, that's scary. I not to punt on the question, but this summer, I think it is this summer, there's going to be a handbook published by a consortium of children's museums led by the Children's Museum in Madison, Wisconsin. That is going to be a playbook for parents, grandparents, caregivers, children's museums, libraries, you name it, right? To help us all better talk with our young children. I am the father of a young child and have another young child on the way. And I would say that, we living here in the mountains of Western North Carolina, where we have had tremendous opportunities to just get him out in nature. We are immensely privileged in that we're surrounded on three sides. Our little town of Blowing Rock, North Carolina, is surrounded on three sides by federal lands, Forest Service and National Park Service. And so, his fascination with mushrooms, for example, is, provides an opportunity for us, for my wife and I, to talk about nature, taking care of nature. Let's not just stomp on the mushrooms to have fun, to gratuitously stomp on the mushrooms and destroy them and see what happens. But that's a living thing that needs to be cared for and protected. So, I'm really a fan of children who are proximate to the planet. We all live on the planet, but are we really close to the planet, right? And do we raise our children in real proximity to the planet? I think children who are raised in proximity to the planet, proximity to nature, are going to grow up to care for it. And it also has positive impacts now, right? Children who are out in nature, for example, there's some evidence that they better self-regulate, they're calmer, these sorts of things, and so it's helping them now, not just in the future, to be in love with nature, so that they will be people who want to save the planet, but to develop the resilience and the capacities that they need now to not only survive but to flourish in the context of disruptions, climate-related disruptions and other disruptions that are really going to challenge their resilience.
Thank you. How will I get that handbook?
I need to track that information down. I believe it's going to be launched at a summit in July, at which I will be speaking, but I can try and get that information to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Janine, your turn.
Hi, thanks for coming. Great talk. My question has to do, you've spoken about improving early childhood resilience to heat, disaster, loss of access. Did your report or the report also discuss the intersection between climate and early childhood diet, particularly with regard to caloric efficiency of the kind of foods that are presented to this segment of humanity?
Nothing immediately comes to mind in our report, but in the K-12 report, there was an emphasis in particular on food waste and school meals. But I can't think of anything in our report that directly addressed that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it looks like that's all the questions that we have from our attendees. Oh, Gary has another question. Go for it, Gary. You're muted.
Yeah, I'll get there. Yeah, thank you. I saw that we can't let Joe off without another question. One of the ways to reach out to children is through the schools, of course. So what can you do there? Schools are also a great opportunity for cooling centers.
Yeah.
So that's something the city can work with. But as far as our local LASD school district is grappling with a deficit that I'm sure they'll be able to sort it out, but there's about $2 million that they're going to have to find some cuts. So in the face of budgetary constraints, what can schools do?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's not really my area of expertise. I come at this more from the health side than from the education side. But and I would reference again the K-12 climate action plan that our colleagues at This Is Planet Ed created. But I think that there are, certainly there are lots of little curricular tweaks, so to speak, that schools can implement to ensure children are scientifically literate, they're literate about the planet, and so forth, in ways that we know are going to benefit planet and society over the long haul. There are also things that can be done at the school infrastructure level, right? Some of those are more costly than others. Solar panels on the roof of every school in the country, something that would be great to see. There are other things that might actually save money, right? So vegetarian meals most of the week in school cafeterias would, one of the worst things we do for the planet, frankly, is eat red meat. And there are changes that can be made in school meals and in the disposal of food waste in schools as well. So again, the K-12 climate action plan, thisisplaneted.org, has a gajillion recommendations for K-12 schools that I'd encourage you to take a look at.
Good, thank you.
But I mean, I will say there's a lot of superintendent leadership in particular. I mean, you look at there are school districts like Denver, which historically has not built schools with air conditioning, right? And now needs to. And so there are a lot of superintendents who are looking at their budgets and they're seeing that climate is driving some big costs, particularly around facilities, that they're going to have to come up with the money for. And so I think anything that they can do, they're quite interested in addressing this issue so as to not only protect children when they're in school, ensure that children are able to get to school, be safe when they're at school, but also to mitigate so that they can lower their facilities costs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Denver had to close. A number of schools were closed in Denver in September, and maybe I think even in October. We have a colleague who's based in Denver. There were several missed school days in the earliest part of the school year because a lot of the schools do not have air conditioning, and so kids it's directly impacting instructional time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Claire, your turn. You're muted.
Well, my question, I did have a question about schools since I was a school teacher, but now my question has to do with my organization of Silicon Valley AUW. We do a lot of work with not local government specifically, or legislation for local governments, but addressing legislation that the state assembly or Senate is doing. And so I was just wondering if you have any suggestions of like bills or legislation that we could be looking for that would help in the local area.
Yeah, I mean,
anything.
Yeah. So
Especially for children.
let me give you an example of something that we're going to be tracking. So each state is required, I think, every 3 years to do a CCDF, Child Care Development Fund, or block grant plan. And this is a tremendous opportunity for us to insert young children and child and family serving systems and programs resilience into existing funding streams, into policy making that has to happen, not necessarily at the legislative level in Sacramento, but at the state agency level. And so, there are certainly things like that. I think that there have been some. I'm a little over my skis, but on an organization called Undaunted K-12 was championing a bill that passed the California legislature and then was vetoed by Governor Newsom last year, that would have driven action on climate friendly and climate resilient schools in California. So you might want to look up that organization for some California specific legislation. And I don't know if they're planning to get that reintroduced or what. My understanding is it passed with pretty sizable margin, at least significant margin. And I did read the veto message, but that's been several months. And I think the governor was frankly concerned about additional costs, particularly for facilities.
Could you give me the name of that organization again?
Undaunted.
Oh, Undone. Okay, great.
K-12.
That's great. And I see that Janine has her hand up again, but before we go to Janine, Adine put a question in the chat for Joe Waters. What gives you hope?
Part of what gives me hope is that we live in a country where we have a democratic system of government that allows us to propose new ideas to policymakers like this. We have funders who are willing to back us. So in some sense, what gives me hope is that for the last 2 years, I've been able to have conversations with people across the United States and across the world who are interested in this and who are wanting to do something to make sure that children can flourish despite the damage that we've done to the planet over the last 150 years. So, I hope it doesn't sound too trite or anything like that, but being in these sorts of conversations is incredibly hopeful for me. It would be very easy for me to publish blog posts and no one to call, but we've created a whole think tank that is collaborating with some of the best people in the world to drive action at the intersection of young children and climate, and that very fact is hopeful. And of course, I would not be a good dad if I didn't say I'm hopeful to come home at the end of the day after working on these issues to a 3-year-old who has the whole world before him and knows really nothing about all these things that stress us out as adults living in the 21st century in the United States.
Okay, before we give Janine the opportunity for the last question, Joe Waters said he could stay for a few minutes, but I know some of the rest of you may need to leave now since it is 9:30. So I want to make a few announcements before we continue with the last question for Joe. Our next meeting will be on Friday, January 26th from 8:30 to 9:30, also via Zoom. Please join us for a discussion entitled Making Los Altos a Great Place Where People Prosper with Steve Lawton, who is the co-chair of the Urban Land Institute Bay Area Programs Committee. Also, if you would like to be added to the LACC mailing list to get notification of these events, please send an email to info@losaltoscommunitycoalition.org. This email has also been posted in the chat for your convenience. And lastly, a big thank you to the Los Altos Mountain View Community Foundation for providing LACC with financial and in-kind support. Thank you, Adine and company. Okay, Janine, last question, over to you.
Thank you. My last question is pretty general. You had mentioned early on in your presentation best practices. Is part of your report or part of your organization's work to create or has created a clearinghouse for these best practices so that people can kind of get right to the gist of it?
Yeah, it's kind of the next step for
Ah.
us is to, you know, we've laid out tools with laid out a report with recommendations, and the next step is to really develop the tools and the platforms to help local communities, state legislators, federal government, and others implement those recommendations. So I'll give you an example of something that we want to do is to create you know, a template heat emergency preparedness plan for state child care administrators that they can, you know, make a few edits for their particular context and implement. There are template city ordinances that we could also, you know, there's a whole range of things that we could do. Like everybody else in this sector, we're limited by the funding we have and our you know, capacity, but certainly we want to run as fast as we can to get as many tools as are useful into the hands of people all across the country to implement these recommendations.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I would
Janine.
if you know, and there's some pieces of this that I would like, for example, the Arsht Rock Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council has an excellent heat action platform that allows you to go and choose the size city you are, the density that you have, and so forth. And it makes recommendations of policies at various costs that you could implement. And
Can
many
you
of
repeat? Can you
many
repeat the name of that?
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Many of them would be incredibly useful for improving outcomes and protecting our youngest children. It's ARSHT, ARSHT, Rock Resilience Center.
Thank you so much. Check it out.
But you know, that's only focused on heat. There's
Yeah.
more that needs to be
Yeah.
done on air quality. There's more that needs to be done on emergency preparedness, you name it.
Right. Well, heat is likely to be one of our big issues, especially with wildfires that we've had in California.
Yeah, y'all. I mean, so I maybe should have mentioned this an hour ago, but in September, I spent the day with parents of young children in Santa Clara County, listening to them and hearing directly what their concerns are for a healthy, safe, clean environment for their children. And I would say that three things emerged that were quite interesting to us. These are all parents who have young children in Santa Clara County. One, lack of access to affordable, clean green space was something that they all identified. These are mostly low-income families, and so you know, ability to drive 30 minutes or 45 minutes to a green space where their kids can play. Heat, keeping their kids inside in the summer, and so a strong sense that there's not a cool place for kids to go outside of the home, and so they end up sitting on the couch, watching TV and playing video games in the summer because it's dangerous to go outside, right? And that's obviously not something we want for our youngest children. And then, you know, let me just say this too, in addition, like there was very little that they said in terms of needing information. I think they know, like, climate change is a problem. It's impacting their kids. They did not need to be convinced of that. And then this would be number 3. But I do think that they need concrete tools or guidance, right? It's just guidance. We get guidance from our pediatrician or our family doctor on how to better support feeding if our infant is not feeding well. They need guidance about what to do in the case of a 110-degree day if you have a 2-month-old. They don't necessarily know that. But I do think they see the challenge. They see that we're living in a disrupted climate, and they didn't need to be convinced of that at all. But they led with outdoor space as the thing that they were most concerned about. Cool, shaded, clean outdoor space.
Well, please, everyone, join me in thanking Joe Waters for a great conversation today.
It's great to be with you all.
We look forward to seeing you all next time on January 26th with Steve Lawton. Thank you so much.